All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're going to explore the truly extraordinary story of how Algeria fought one of the absolute bloodiest 20th century independence wars just to break free from the French Empire. Imagine for a second living in your own homeland, but you're treated as a complete stranger. Your land is taken, your voice is totally silenced, and your future is micromanaged by a foreign power. Well, for 132 years, the people of Algeria endured exactly that under French rule. But when asking for peaceful change failed, Algeria chose a very different path. So think about this for a second. What if a war for freedom became so intense, so brutally fought, that it shook an entire global empire to its core? This question really sets the stage for our story today. We're looking at how a marginalized, outgunned population took on a deeply entrenched colonial heavyweight. What followed was a conflict so fierce, where ordinary city streets turned into literal battlefields, that it permanently changed the global landscape. Section 1. A colony unlike any other. Unlike its other colonies, France considered Algeria an integral part of its own territory. They literally divided the land into French departments. To the leaders in Paris, Algeria wasn't just a colony, it was France. But on the ground, there was this staggering generations-long power imbalance. On one side, you've got nearly 1 million European settlers, known as the Pieds Noirs. They basically held all the cards, controlling the richest farmland, the businesses, and almost all the political power. On the other side, you've got over 9 million Muslim Algerians. Despite being the overwhelming majority, they were essentially second-class citizens in their own backyard. They paid taxes, sure, but they had severely limited political rights, and they often ended up working in the exact same land that had been taken from their ancestors. Over 132 years, that tension just built and built. France first invaded back in 1830, but the absolute breaking point came in May 1945. In this really grim twist of historical irony, on the exact day the rest of the world was celebrating the end of World War II, Algerians demanding their independence were met with overwhelming, lethal violence. During the Sétif and Guelma massacre, French authorities killed thousands. For so many Algerians, this horrific event was the final, tragic proof that peaceful reform was literally impossible. Moving into Section 2, the spark of revolution. After decades of grinding poverty and violent crackdowns, the Algerian people realized that freedom was only going to come through armed struggle. Enter the FLN, the National Liberation Front. They emerged from the shadows in 1954, and they essentially declare that Algeria is done begging for rights. They're going to fight for them. Their demand was totally simple and completely uncompromising: 100% independence from France. Nothing less. Then, bam, everything completely shifts on November 1, 1954, a day that goes down in history as Toussaint Rouge, or Red All Saints' Day. Under the cover of darkness, FLN hiders launched these highly coordinated attacks all across Algeria. They hit French military installations, police posts, communication lines, the whole operation. But French officials completely miscalculated. They just brushed off these initial highly planned strikes as mere terrorism. They thought, oh, this is a localized uprising, we'll crush it in no time. They refused to negotiate because, in their minds, you don't negotiate with a piece of your own country. Well, they were very wrong. Section 3. The brutal reality of war. What started as scattered nighttime attacks exploded into a full-blown nationwide rebellion. And if we look at the tactics, it is a stark contrast. The FLN relied on classic guerrilla warfare. They used mobility, deep local support, and psychological tactics to strike fast and melt right back into the mountains. The French military, on the other hand, just brought overwhelming conventional force to the table, eventually dropping in over 400,000 troops with modern aircraft and heavy armor. But here's the thing: military superiority can't solve a fundamentally political problem. The war became an absolute nightmare for ordinary civilians caught in the crossfire. Both sides engaged in severe brutality. The FLN targeted collaborators and settlers, while French forces utilized widespread torture, summary executions, and literally uprooted millions of Algerians into forcefully controlled camps. And that brings us to a huge, dramatic turning point: the legendary Battle of Algiers in 1956 and 1957. FLN operatives, many of them women actually, planted bombs in cafes and public spaces where Europeans gathered. These attacks completely shocked the world. In response, French paratroopers came in and launched a relentless, severe counterinsurgency campaign. Now, militarily speaking, the French paratroopers won this urban battle by tearing apart the FLN's network through mass arrests and heavy surveillance. But politically, they lost something much bigger. The horrific, highly publicized images of torture and repression deeply damaged France's reputation on the global stage and only acted as gasoline on the fire for Algerian independence. Section 4. An Empire in Crisis. This war didn't just destabilize North Africa. It triggered a massive political crisis that ripped through the Mediterranean and nearly tore France apart from the inside. France was finding itself backed into a corner internationally. Newly independent nations across Asia and Africa were rallying behind Algeria, keeping the pressure extremely high at the United Nations. You had countries like Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia providing crucial sanctuary and training for FLN fighters. Plus, remember, this is all happening during the Cold War. The Soviet Union is out there loudly criticizing French colonialism, so France is completely isolated diplomatically. And at home, French citizens were appalled by the reports of atrocities, which led to profound political chaos in Paris by 1958. So this absolute domestic chaos paves the way for the return of a legendary wartime hero, General Charles de Gaulle. When he stepped back into power, he stood in front of cheering European settlers and famously declared, "I have understood you." And when de Gaulle said this, those pieds noirs and the military hardliners firmly believed he was promising to keep Algeria French forever. They really thought they finally had their champion. But here is the massive plot twist. De Gaulle actually defied all of their expectations. He was a supreme pragmatist. He looked at the situation and quickly realized, sure, France could keep winning these tactical military skirmishes, but they were never, ever going to win the actual loyalty of millions of Algerians. The war was politically and morally a dead end. So, to the shock of many, he started gradually shifting his policy toward Algerian self-determination. Well, you can imagine this realization sparked absolute outrage among the extremists. Furious settlers and hardline military officers got together and formed the OAS, the Secret Armed Organization. In this really desperate, terrifying final escalation, the OAS carried out bombings, assassinations, and terror attacks across both Algeria and mainland France, just trying to stop independence at any cost. De Gaulle himself even survived multiple assassination attempts by them. But despite all this desperate chaos, the French public was just done. They were politically and morally exhausted by the endless years of bloodshed. Section 5. The Price of Freedom. With both sides completely exhausted by the savage violence, a diplomatic breakthrough finally happens. After agonizing negotiations, the historic Évian Accords are signed on March 18, 1962. The very next day, a ceasefire kicks in. By July, the Algerian people hit the polls and vote overwhelmingly, and I mean overwhelmingly, for independence. And then on July 5th, 1962, which is almost poetic because it was exactly 132 years after France first invaded, Algeria officially became a free, sovereign nation. Now, we really need to pause here for a second, because this victory came at a staggering, frankly incomprehensible human cost. Hundreds of thousands of Algerians lost their lives securing their nation's freedom, and some estimates place that casualty number way, way higher. They endured torture, mass displacement, and just unimaginable loss to get there. And the devastating toll of the war rippled across the Mediterranean too, claiming the lives of roughly 25,000 French soldiers. The demographic landscape was literally altered overnight. Nearly 1 million pieds noirs. These are European settlers whose families had lived in Algeria for generations, fled across the sea to France in absolute terror, leaving their ancestral homes behind forever. And it gets even more tragic, because thousands of Harkis, Muslim Algerians who had actively fought alongside the French military, were left behind to face brutal, widespread reprisals. So why does all of this matter today? What's the real legacy here? The Algerian Revolution was so much more than just a local war. It became a powerful global symbol. It spread like wildfire, inspiring anti-colonial and liberation movements across Africa, Asia, and everywhere in between. It proved to the world that a determined, marginalized group of people could actually stand up and defeat a heavily armed global superpower. For France, it really marked the beginning of the end for their colonial empire. And for Algeria, independence brought incredible national pride and sovereignty, but it also handed them the massive, daunting challenge of trying to build a nation from the ashes of a brutal war. Algeria didn't just receive freedom as some sort of gift. They seized it with unwavering determination, fighting street by street and village by village. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this one thought. Empires can conquer land, sure, but can they ever forever conquer a people's desire to be free? The answer is no, because when an entire nation rises up and absolutely refuses to be ruled, history itself begins to change. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.